The bells rang in Hollow Creek, not for joy, but to warn. Smoke from the cook fires mixed with dust as townsfolk crowded near the church, where a runaway bride in a torn white dress was dragged by her wrist across the square. Her name was Clara May, and her bare feet left streaks of blood across the wooden steps as she struggled, not crying, not pleading, just silent, chin high, rage in her eyes. The man gripping her arm was Cyrus Blackwell, her intended, a wealthy landowner twice her age, red-faced with humiliation and fury. "She ran from her vows," he bellowed, turning to the preacher. "Tried to disgrace me." The preacher hesitated, but the crowd was already nodding. This was law here. Land and name mattered more than truth. They tied her wrists to the church rail with fraying rope. Her dress, once silk and white, was caked in mud and torn at the shoulder. She stared at the crowd, searching for one face that might care. None met her gaze, not the women clutching their children, not the shopkeepers, not even the sheriff. Then the whip cracked, once, twice. Her body jerked with each strike, but she stayed standing, her lips pressed together, eyes locked forward. Somewhere past the pain, past the humiliation, she thought of her brother's grave on the reservation, of the stories her Comanche mother once whispered about women who became wind and fire. She could not be small again, not for them. On the third strike, something shifted in the air, a presence, a silence inside the noise. From the far edge of town, a lone rider appeared, his paint horse kicking up dust with each step. He wore a bandolier across his chest, and his braids hung down like coiled rope. No one moved as he dismounted, not even Cyrus. The Lakota warrior walked forward, silent and tall, his shadow long in the afternoon sun. Clara blinked once, then twice. She knew him, not by name, but by the way he looked at her, not with pity, not even anger, but something older, something fierce. Without a word, he reached for the rope. Cyrus stepped forward. "She's mine," he began, but never finished. The warrior struck him once with the back of his hand, and Cyrus crumpled like rotted wood. No one dared move. The warrior lifted Clara into his arms, her blood staining his shirt, and walked through the stunned crowd like Moses parting the sea. No one stopped him. No one spoke. And just like that, Clara was gone, with a man no one dared question, into a wilderness she never feared. The wind cooled her skin as the horse galloped away from the town that had watched her suffer. Clara leaned into the warrior's chest, her wrists raw, her vision blurry from blood loss and exhaustion. But something in her, deep and primal, refused to sleep. She didn't know his name, but his arms were steady, his body warm, and he didn't speak, not even once, as the land changed from town to trees, from judgment to breath. Hours passed in silence until they reached a small clearing, where a modest camp sat beneath a canopy of cedar and pine. The fire was low, its coals glowing red, and a woven blanket hung between two trees like a shelter. He dismounted gently, then lifted her down as if she weighed no more than a story passed from mother to daughter. She tried to speak, but found her throat cracked and useless. He gave her water first, pressing a canteen to her lips without force. Then he unwrapped a cloth and dabbed salve onto her lashes, her wrists, the stripe along her back where the whip had kissed bone. Clara winced, but he worked without pause, not like a man eager to be thanked, but like one who had seen pain before and knew the work of undoing it took patience. When he finally sat, she gathered enough voice to ask, "Why?" It came out broken. He didn't answer at first, just stirred the fire. Then he said softly, "Because they would have taken your soul. I saw it slipping." She blinked at him, surprised not by the words but by the tenderness in them. "Who are you?" she rasped. "They call me Hawk in the East, he said, "but names change, and so do men." She nodded slowly. "You knew my mother's people?" His gaze lingered on hers. "I knew your mother." The world tilted for a moment. "She was brave," he added. "And so are you. You ran." Clara let her head fall back against the tree. Her breath caught on a tear. "I didn't want to die in a dress I never chose." "You won't," he said simply. "Not today." That night, as the fire crackled low, he slept nearby with his hand still on his knife. Not from fear of her, but from what the world might still send. Clara closed her eyes, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like pine and smoke, and for the first time in years, the ache in her body didn't outweigh the quiet rising in her chest. She had run. She had survived. And somewhere deep inside, something fierce had woken with her. At dawn, Clara woke to birdsong and a light mist threading through the trees. Her back ached, but it was dull now, not searing, and she realized Hawk in the east had left a poultice on her spine during the night. She touched it, feeling its warmth, then sat up slowly, her eyes scanning the camp. He wasn't there. For a moment, panic surged. Abandonment was too familiar. But then she saw him through the trees, kneeling by the stream, washing the blood from her wedding dress. The white fabric floated in the current like a ghost refusing to drown. He didn't look at her as he worked, didn't speak. Clara walked barefoot toward him, the earth damp and cool. "Why save that?" she asked quietly, standing just behind him. He wrung out the cloth carefully before replying. "Because it's yours, and no man should take what's yours and claim it for his own." She stared at him, stunned. Not at the words, but at how they made her feel, as if something sacred had been returned. When he handed the dress to her, it was no longer a symbol of ownership or shame. It was fabric. Nothing more. Nothing less. That afternoon, they packed the camp. Hawk said few words, but his silence was never cold. As they traveled deeper into the hills, Clara began to understand his way of being, watching the trail, listening to the birds, knowing where berries grew and where wild animals drank. He didn't talk to fill space. He let it breathe. That evening, they came upon a circle of small cabins nestled in a meadow surrounded by trees. A Lakota woman stepped out, eyes widening when she saw Clara. She didn't ask questions. She simply opened the door and beckoned them in. The warmth inside hit Clara like a memory. Fire, bread, tobacco, and something else. Safety. The woman's name was Mina, Hawk's cousin, and she made no fuss over Clara's bruises. She only offered tea and a quiet place by the fire. That night, Clara folded her dress and placed it in a wooden chest beside the cot. Not as a keepsake, but as a piece of her past that no longer owned her. Outside, the stars burned white above the black pines, and somewhere in the trees, Hawk kept watch again. Clara knew it without seeing. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It wasn't over. But she had stepped off the path they'd chosen for her and into one she would name herself. And that was more than escape. It was the beginning of return. The days that followed unfolded not like a grand story, but like stitches in a quilt. Quiet, necessary, and warm. Clara helped Mina grind corn and hang herbs to dry, her muscles aching in new, unfamiliar ways that had nothing to do with running or flinching. She watched the land stretch wide beyond the trees and felt its stillness settle in her ribs. Hawk came and went from the cabin without explanation. Tracking game, fetching water, sometimes just watching the ridge in long, thoughtful silences. He never hovered, never stared, but somehow he was always close when she needed him. One afternoon, as she swept the cabin's porch with a bundle of straw, a small rabbit darted across the yard, scattering Mina's laundry. Clara startled and dropped the broom. From the tree line, Hawk stepped out, his lips curved into a smile that was so rare and sudden it startled her more than the rabbit had. "You'd think I saw a bear," she muttered, brushing her skirt off. Hawk tilted his head. "Bears make less noise." The words came slow and dry, but they were laced with quiet humor, and before she could stop herself, Clara laughed. It caught in her throat at first, as if her body had forgotten how, but then it came whole, surprising even her. Hawk's smile widened slightly, just enough to light his eyes. Mina, watching from inside, said nothing. But that night she placed extra berries in Clara's bowl and hummed a tune Clara vaguely remembered from her mother's youth. The wind outside had grown sharp, promising the edge of winter, and yet the hearth glowed with more than fire. For the first time in months, perhaps years, Clara didn't dread sleep. She didn't flinch at shadows. She didn't feel the need to run. Her body was still healing, but her spirit, beaten, starved, silenced, was stirring again. She thought of the church steps, the cold hands, the silence of the town. And then she thought of the way Hawk looked at the stars, how he moved through the world like it owed him nothing and still gave him space. That night, before bed, Clara whispered to Mina, "Do you think scars change who we are?" Mina didn't answer right away. She just stirred the coals and said, "Scars remind us where we ended, but they don't tell us where we begin." Outside, Hawk stood with his back to the wind, eyes on the trees, watching the shadows not out of fear, but out of love for what now lived behind them. The calm was broken 3 days later when hooves echoed against the mountain stone, and dust rose at the edge of the meadow. Clara had just stepped outside with a woven basket when she saw the horse, a thick-chested bay carrying a man in a brown duster and badge pinned to his chest. Sheriff Lyle Harding. She froze, basket tight in her hands. He pulled up before the cabin, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. "Heard a white girl ran off with a savage," he said. "Funny how trouble always finds its way to the pines." Mina stepped out behind Clara without a word. Inside, Hawk's footsteps were already nearing, slow and deliberate. Clara's heart beat louder than the wind. "You can't be here," Mina said, her voice low. "This is Lakota land." The sheriff spat. "Law don't stop at trees. Her husband back in Hollow Creek wants her returned. Says she stole from him. His dignity, his money, maybe even his land." Hawk stepped onto the porch. "She stole nothing," he said. "She took back her name." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "That dress still say Blackwell stitched in it?" Clara's spine straightened. She stepped between them. "I burned that dress." The sheriff looked at her then. Really looked. Her bruises had faded, but the fire in her eyes hadn't. "Girl," he said, voice gruff, "you know what they'll say if you don't come back. That you ran off and laid down with—" "Don't," she snapped, voice sharper than he expected. "You think I care what they say? Where were you when they whipped me like a criminal? When no one stopped it?" He looked at Hawk, then back at her, then down. "I ain't here to drag you," he muttered. "Just to say there's a price now. Blackwell put a bounty on your head. For theft of honor. Whatever the hell that means." Hawk didn't flinch. "Let him come." The sheriff looked between them again, then tipped his hat. "For what it's worth," he said, "you look more alive here than you ever did in that town." Then he turned and rode off without another word. Clara stood still, breath shaky, eyes on the dust trail he left behind. "He'll come," she said. Hawk nodded. "Let him." That night, Clara didn't tremble as she slept. Her hands didn't clutch at blankets. She'd stood between men, between law and survival, and hadn't backed down. That mattered more than safety. It meant she was finally hers. The first one came at dusk 2 days later. He wore a torn gray coat and rode a paint horse with one blind eye. Clara saw him before Hawk did, sitting still atop a hill above the cabin, watching, unmoving. Hawk stepped beside her, his rifle already in hand. "He's not Law," Clara said quietly. Hawk didn't answer. The rider turned and vanished without a word. But it was a sign. The bounty was real, and it had begun to pull vultures from the dry corners of the frontier. That night, Mina didn't say much, but she boiled a second pot of coffee and laid a shotgun beneath the floorboards. Clara slept lightly, her ears tuned to every creak of timber and gust of wind. The next morning, a scrap of fabric fluttered from the fence post, Blackwell's family colors torn and knotted. A warning, or a promise. Hawk took Clara to the far ridge to teach her how to aim. Her hands shook, but her eyes didn't flinch. "Don't shoot to kill," he said. "Shoot to stop. Let the earth decide the rest." She fired once, then again. By the fifth shot, the bottle cracked clean in half. When she turned, Hawk was smiling, not proud, but certain. She was no longer just a woman fleeing something. She was someone who could stand when it counted. That night, thunder rolled across the hills, and Clara braided her hair tight. She sat by the fire, polishing the rifle Hawk had given her. "What happens if they come in a group?" she asked. "Then we fight as one," he said. "We don't run?" "Not anymore." Outside, Mina hung sacred herbs along the doorway. Inside, Clara placed a stone in her pocket, the one her mother used to carry. It was smooth and black, shaped like a bird in flight. She had always thought it was meant to bring her home. Now she realized it was a reminder that home wasn't a place. It was a stand, a fire, a voice that would not be silenced. Before sleep, Hawk sat beside her. "You're not the same woman who stood on those church steps," he said. Clara met his eyes. "Number that woman died, and I'm not mourning her." He nodded. "Good. Because I think the one who replaced her is worth protecting." Outside, the wind howled and coyotes called across the pines, but inside, the cabin stood strong. It wasn't fear that kept them awake now. It was the knowledge that tomorrow might demand everything. But this time, she'd meet it standing. He arrived just past midday, wearing a dustless coat and a vest studded with polished gold buttons that gleamed in the sunlight like they'd never known a poor man's hand. Clara saw him first as she gathered water from the creek. His horse was sleek, his boots clean, and he carried himself with the cold ease of someone used to being obeyed. Blackwell. He didn't ride fast. He didn't need to. He thought the land owed him return, and that Clara's body, like everything else in his life, was something he could reclaim. She didn't run. She walked back to the cabin slow and calm, her heart loud but steady. Mina spotted the rider and went to the root cellar without a word, returning with 2 worn pistols wrapped in cloth. Hawk in the east stood on the porch, arms folded, waiting. Clara took her place beside him, not behind. Blackwell dismounted 5 yards out, a smirk sliding across his face. "Didn't expect you to be so feral, Clara," he said, "but I suppose it fits." Hawk didn't move. Clara answered. "You sent men to beat me, to sell me like a mule. What I became is what you made, and what you'll never touch again." Blackwell laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think this half-wild squatter can protect you? That living in dirt and trees makes you clean?" "Cleaner than your house ever felt," she replied. "At least the truth lives here." His gaze snapped to Hawk. "She's mine by law." "She was never yours by heart," Hawk said, "and that's what law forgets." Blackwell's hand dropped toward his sidearm. Hawk stepped forward once, only once, and something in his silence made even the birds go still. Blackwell hesitated. He wasn't used to men who didn't bluff or bark. He was used to games, not war. Clara raised her own voice. "You ride out now, or you stay forever beneath this ridge?" Blackwell studied her. Really looked. She was bruised, calloused, hair braided back, dress plain, but her eyes didn't flinch. Not anymore. "I'll be back," he growled. With more than words, Hawk's voice was soft. "Then we'll give you silence." Blackwell turned and rode away without another word. When the dust settled, Clara let her breath out slow. Her hands didn't shake. Mina passed her a cup of water. Hawk said nothing, but the look he gave her was not of a protector. It was of an equal, someone who had chosen to stand beside fire, not in front of it. Word traveled fast in the high country, even when no one spoke it aloud. By sunrise the next day, riders began arriving. Not bounty hunters, but neighbors, elders, mothers from distant Lakota camps, even a Cherokee tanner Clara had once met in silence. They didn't come armed. They came with eyes wide open. Some brought bread, others bundles of sage, a few with scraps of cloth or beads. No one asked Clara to speak, but they looked at her differently than before. Not like a runaway bride or a scandal, but like someone who had survived something the land itself remembered. Hawk stayed close, saying little. Mina moved among the guests with quiet grace, but Clara stood at the cabin's edge, not quite knowing what to do with hands that had always been used for fleeing or defending. A Lakota elder named Tall Willow approached and offered her a carved feather. "For the child you will raise one day," she said softly. Not with anger, but with knowing. Clara felt her throat tighten. She wasn't a mother. She wasn't even whole. But they were seeing something beyond that. She looked at the faces gathered. Some pale, some sun-browned, some marked with wind and time, and realized they weren't there for her pain. They were there because of what she did with it. By mid-morning, Mina called for silence. She stood in the clearing holding a woven shawl the color of riverstone and sunset. "The valley has always been a place of passage," she said. "Some run from it, some through it. But now and then, it chooses someone to stay, not as guest, but as keeper." She turned to Clara and placed the shawl over her shoulders. "We name you Mother of the Ridge," she said, "because you chose to bleed and not bend." Hawk in the east stepped forward then, not smiling but eyes wet. He placed his palm gently on her back, not to guide her, but to anchor her. And the moment held, not with cheers or applause, but with silence deep as the soil. That night, when the fires were banked and the guests had returned to their trails, Clara sat alone outside the cabin. She held the feather and ran her fingers along its carved spine. She had no child, no land deed, no legal name that meant anything anymore. But she had something else. The valley had spoken, and she had answered. Not with words, but with the unbroken steadiness of a heart that finally knew where it beat. The rain came hard and sudden that night, pounding the roof with a fury that felt almost sentient. Clara lay awake, listening to it, hand resting on the carved feather beside her bed, while the embers in the hearth pulsed like the slow beat of a steady heart. Hawk wasn't inside. He hadn't returned after walking the ridge, and a knot of worry twisted inside her. Not fear of abandonment, but of the kind of silence that arrives before storms. She rose, wrapped herself in the shawl Mina had draped over her shoulders earlier, and stepped outside barefoot into the rain. The world was silver and black and alive. She found him standing beneath the great pine where the wind broke just enough to breathe. His shirt clung to him, hair wet, but his eyes were calm. "I thought you left," she said quietly. Hawk didn't look at her right away. "I was trying to remember who I was before I saw you on those church steps." Her throat caught. "And who were you?" He turned to her then. "Were someone who thought the war had taken all the beauty from the world. Then you screamed, and I remembered that rage can be beautiful too, when it's honest." Clara stepped closer, rain slipping down her cheeks, mixing with the heat behind her eyes. "I didn't scream for help," she said. "I screamed because I was tired of swallowing it." "And you never have to again." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. Inside it, a ring. Simple, carved wood with a tiny turquoise bead set into the grain. "This is not a vow of ownership," he said, placing it in her hand. "It's a vow to never let you forget who you are, no matter what name the world tries to pin on you." She stared at it, heart thundering louder than the storm. Then, without ceremony, she slipped it on. "I don't need a church," she whispered. "Just a place where my voice is safe." He nodded. "Then you've already found your altar." Behind them, lightning cracked across the hills, but the thunder couldn't drown out what had passed between them. That night, they sat beneath the pine while the rain fell around them like a baptism. No kiss, no promises, just breath, closeness, and the quiet knowledge that love, real love, didn't need witnesses. It only needed truth. The storm passed before dawn, leaving the world scrubbed clean, as if even the trees had taken a deep breath. Mist rose from the ridges like smoke from an old pipe, and Clara stood at the edge of the clearing with bare feet sunk into damp earth, watching the sky shift from gray to amber. Inside the cabin, Mina brewed something warm with herbs that smelled like cedar and lemon balm. Hawk sat by the fire, carving a piece of driftwood into the shape of a bird. Quiet, content, no longer watching the door. There had been no more riders, no more threats. Blackwell's name had vanished like dust in the wind, and the bounty he'd placed had faded with it, swallowed by silence and refusal. What remained now was a life. Not perfect, but honest. Clara walked the ridge path alone that morning, wearing the shawl the valley had chosen for her, and the wooden ring that hadn't left her finger since he gave it to her. She found herself near the church ruins, the same steps where blood had dried between her shoulders. The doors were gone now, the bell long silent, but the place still held echoes. She didn't flinch. She knelt, placed a stone where her shame had once lived, and whispered, "You don't own me anymore." Behind her, a small voice called out. A boy, no more than 7, stood watching from the trail, hat too big for his head, a toy bow slung across his back. "Are you the woman who screamed?" he asked. Clara blinked. "I was," he smiled. "Mama said you're the reason people started talking again. She baked you cornbread." He handed her a cloth-wrapped bundle and ran off. Clara laughed, a full laugh, not a guarded one, and sat on the step with the gift in her lap, the rising sun warming her cheeks. Later, Mina joined her, settling beside her with a cup of tea and eyes that had seen many winters. "You didn't just survive," she said. "You changed the wind." Hawk arrived with a basket of apples and a look that spoke volumes. Not ownership, not pride, just quiet admiration. As the three of them sat beneath the wide sky, laughter from children echoed through the trees, not sharp or mocking, but light. Clara leaned into the moment. She wasn't running, she wasn't hiding, she wasn't healing anymore, she had healed. And as the sun lifted higher over the valley, no one mocked her. Because now even the land knew her name.